I spent 40 years building a fortune in silence while my son believed I was barely scraping by. But I never imagined that Robert, the very child I sacrificed everything for, would demand I sign over my home to him while treating me like a burden to be managed. What he didn't know, when he marched into my kitchen with those property transfer papers, was that I had been preparing for this moment ever since I caught him whispering to his wife about putting me in the cheapest nursing home they could find, once they had my house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The spring rain drummed gently against the kitchen window as I poured hot water into my teacup, the familiar scent of chamomile rising in delicate wisps. My arthritis was acting up again, the dull ache in my fingers a constant reminder of the passage of time. Outside, the maple trees I'd planted when Robert was born swayed in the breeze, their branches now thick and strong enough to cast shadows across the entire backyard. I had just settled into my favorite chair by the window when I heard the distinct sound of tires on wet gravel, followed by car doors slamming shut with unnecessary force. I knew it was Robert before he even knocked. He always parked too close to my flower beds, crushing the edges of my carefully tended violets without ever noticing. The way he knocked, 3 sharp, demanding raps, spoke volumes about his mood. I took another sip of tea and closed my eyes briefly, centering myself for what was about to come. "It's open," I called, my voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in my chest. The door swung open, and there stood my son, his tall frame filling the doorway, raindrops glistening on his expensive wool coat. Behind him lurked Diane, his wife of 15 years, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair untouched by the rain thanks to the designer umbrella clutched in her manicured hand. "Mom," Robert said, not quite meeting my eyes. There was no kiss on the cheek, no warm embrace. Those gestures had vanished years ago, replaced by the cool efficiency of a man who saw family obligations as items to be checked off a list. "You're looking well?" The obligatory comment hung in the air, hollow and meaningless. I smiled anyway, motioning for them to sit. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, already rising to fetch more cups. Diane shook her head quickly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Robert dropped a thick manila envelope onto the table between us with a heavy thud. "We don't have time for tea, Mom. We need to discuss something important." His voice had that quality I recognized all too well, the tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable while actually steamrolling over everyone else's feelings. I settled back into my chair, my gaze dropping to the envelope. "What's this?" I asked, though I already had my suspicions. Robert cleared his throat, unbuttoning his coat but not removing it, another sign he didn't plan to stay long. "It's about the house," he said, gesturing vaguely at the walls around us. "And your future care?" Diane nodded encouragingly beside him, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We've been thinking, with you turning 70 next month, it might be time to consider more appropriate living arrangements." I felt a familiar weight settle in my stomach. For 3 years now, Robert had been dropping hints about selling my home, my sanctuary for nearly 4 decades. But today felt different. The envelope, his posture, Diane's calculating gaze, they had come with a plan, and I was meant to simply go along with it. "What Robert means," Diane interjected, her voice honey-sweet, "is that this house is just too much for you to manage on your own, Margaret. All these stairs, this big yard, it's not safe anymore." She reached across the table as if to pat my hand, but I subtly shifted away, lifting my teacup instead. Her hand hovered awkwardly before retreating. "I manage just fine," I replied quietly. "Mrs. Patterson's grandson helps with the yard work, and I had the handrails reinforced last year." I looked directly at Robert. "I have no intention of leaving my home." Robert's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple, just like his father's used to when he was frustrated. "Mom, be reasonable. This house is worth over $450,000 in today's market. That money could secure quality care for you for years to come. And what exactly would happen to this house if I sold it? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The silence that followed confirmed my suspicions. You want it for yourselves. It makes financial sense, Robert said, not bothering to deny it. Why pay for 2 mortgages when we could live here and use the equity from our current house to fund your care? It's the practical solution. I took another sip of tea, using the moment to compose my thoughts. And where exactly would I go in this practical solution? Robert opened the envelope and pulled out a glossy brochure, pushing it across the table toward me. Sunset Gardens. It's a perfectly nice assisted living facility just outside the city. They have activities, medical staff on site, everything you need. I didn't touch the brochure. And my pension would cover this garden paradise? A glance passed between Robert and Diane, quick but telling. Well, not entirely, Robert admitted, but that's why selling the house makes sense. Between your pension, Social Security, and the house proceeds, you'd be set for life. What Robert didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that my pension was far more substantial than he imagined. After a 30-year career at Westlake Investments, rising from secretary to senior financial advisor before my retirement, I had built a comfortable nest egg. But I had never flaunted my financial security, choosing instead to live modestly. Robert, with his luxury cars and designer suits, had simply assumed I was getting by on a secretary's pension. There's no rush to decide right this minute, Diane added, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. But we brought the paperwork just in case. Robert nodded, pulling out a stack of documents and placing them beside the brochure. Property transfer agreement, he explained. Everything's prepared. You sign, and we handle all the details. The casualness with which he presented this life-altering decision sent a surge of indignation through me. How dare they? How dare they walk into my home with paperwork already drawn up, expecting me to simply sign away my life stability? I stared at the papers, memories flooding through me unbidden. This house, with its creaking stairs and temperamental furnace, had been my salvation after Edward died. While Robert went off to college, barely glancing back, I had thrown myself into making mortgage payments, fixing leaky pipes, and creating a home that was truly mine. Every nail hammered, every wall painted, every garden bed dug had been an act of reclaiming my independence. And now my son expected me to hand it all over with the stroke of a pen. I'll need time to think about this, I said finally, pushing the papers back toward him. Robert's face darkened. Mom, you're not getting any younger. Every day you stay in this house is a risk. What if you fall? What if there's a fire? His voice rose slightly, frustration leaking through his professional veneer. You need to be practical about this. Robert, I said softly, I've been practical my entire life. I raised you alone after your father died. I worked 2 jobs to put you through college. I've never made a decision without considering all the angles. I met his gaze steadily. So please don't tell me what I need to do with my own home. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Margaret, we're only thinking of what's best for you, she insisted, though her eyes kept drifting around the room as if mentally cataloging which of my possessions they'd keep and which they'd discard. If that were true, I replied, you'd be asking what I want, not telling me what I need. Robert's patience visibly thinned. Mom, I don't think you understand your financial situation. Your pension barely covers your property taxes and utilities. In a few years, you won't be able to afford to stay here anyway. I almost laughed at the irony. My son, who had never bothered to inquire about my finances, was now lecturing me on my own economic reality. If he had any idea of the investment portfolio I'd built over decades of careful planning, he wouldn't be sitting here trying to convince me I couldn't afford my own home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I appreciate your concern, I said, rising from my chair, signaling that our conversation was over. But I'll need time to consider all my options. Robert stood as well, frustration evident in every line of his body. Mom, don't be difficult about this. We're trying to help. And I'm simply asking for time to think, I replied, my voice firm but calm. Is that really so unreasonable? He ran a hand through his hair. Another gesture so like his father's, it made my heart ache despite my anger. Fine, take a few days. But we need to resolve this soon. The real estate market is hot right now, and we don't want to miss the window. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, I noticed Diane lingering by my china cabinet, eyeing my grandmother's antique tea set with poorly disguised interest. Beautiful, she murmured. It would look perfect in our dining room. It would, I agreed pleasantly. Unfortunately, I promised it to Rebecca years ago. Rebecca was my niece, my late sister's daughter, who called every Sunday without fail and visited whenever her nursing shifts allowed. The flash of annoyance on Diane's face was brief but unmistakable. After they left, I stood at the window watching their luxury SUV back out of my driveway, narrowly missing my flower beds again. The rain had intensified, washing away the last of the spring pollen from the air. I waited until they turned the corner before pulling out my phone and making 2 calls, one to my lawyer, Marcus, and another to my financial advisor, Patricia. What I needed now was information. Specifically, I needed to know if Robert had already taken steps beyond today's conversation. Had he contacted real estate agents, made promises to potential buyers, started measuring for new furniture? Knowledge, as I'd learned over 7 decades of life, was power, especially when dealing with someone who thought they held all the cards. I settled back in my chair, sipping the last of my now cold tea, and reached for the silver-framed photograph on the side table. It showed a much younger me holding Robert as a toddler, his pudgy hands reaching for the camera, his face alight with innocent joy. Where had that little boy gone? When had he transformed into this stranger who saw me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected? The shift hadn't happened overnight. I knew that much. There had been warning signs for years. The increasingly infrequent visits, the way he spoke over me in family gatherings, the disinterest in my opinions unless they aligned with his own. But perhaps the most telling moment had come 3 years. Earlier during the Thanksgiving dinner, I'd spent days preparing. I had excused myself to fetch dessert from the kitchen, leaving Robert and Diane at the dining table. As I approached with the pumpkin pie, I overheard Diane's whispered words that stopped me cold in the hallway. Once we get the house, we shouldn't wait too long to renovate. That kitchen is straight out of the 1980s. Robert's reply had cut deeper than any knife. We'll gut the whole place if necessary. Mom won't need to worry about it anyway. There's a decent enough nursing home across town that takes Medicare patients. Dr. Griffith says he can help fast-track the paperwork when the time comes. They were planning my institutionalization while eating the food I'd lovingly prepared. I had retreated silently to the kitchen, composed myself, and returned with dessert, my smile firmly in place. Neither of them ever knew I'd overheard, but from that day forward, I began preparing for the inevitable confrontation that had finally arrived today. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. I rose slowly, my joints protesting after sitting too long, and made my way to my bedroom. From the back of my closet, I retrieved a small fireproof box, unlocking it with the key I kept on a chain around my neck. Inside lay documents telling a very different story than the one Robert believed. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds. The truth of a lifetime spent not just surviving, but thriving and building wealth in quiet, careful ways. After Edward died when Robert was just 12, leaving us with minimal life insurance and a mortgage we could barely afford, I had made 2 promises to myself. I would never again be financially vulnerable, and I would give Robert every opportunity to succeed. The first goal had required sacrificing elements of the second. Instead of moving to a bigger house in a more prestigious neighborhood, I had stayed put and invested the difference. Rather than buying new cars every few years, I drove the same, reliable sedan for 2 decades and watched my portfolio grow. Robert, however, had seen only the limitations, not the strategic planning. As a teenager, he'd resented our modest lifestyle, embarrassed to bring friends to our shabby home. As a young adult, he'd demanded more financial help than I could give without compromising my long-term security. And now, as a middle-aged man with expensive tastes and insufficient savings, he saw my home as his rightful inheritance, and one he wasn't willing to wait for. I replaced the documents and locked the box, my resolve hardening. Tomorrow, I would begin implementing the contingency plan I'd created years ago but hoped never to use. Robert believed he was dealing with a vulnerable old woman easily manipulated by appeals to her safety and well-being. He was about to discover how profoundly he had underestimated his mother. That night, as I prepared for bed, my phone chimed with a text message. It was from Rebecca. "Just checking in, Aunt Marge. You seemed quiet during our call yesterday. Everything okay?" I smiled at her perceptiveness. Unlike Robert, Rebecca had always been attuned to the subtleties of others' emotions. "Just some family business to sort out," I replied. "Nothing I can't handle. Love you." I added a heart emoji, a small concession to modern communication that always made Rebecca smile. As I settled beneath my quilt, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of my beloved home, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. For years, I had dreaded this confrontation, had lain awake imagining the hurt and betrayal I would feel when Robert finally showed his hand. But now that the moment had arrived, I found myself relieved rather than devastated. The pretense was over. The battle lines were drawn. And I, Margaret Chen, widow, mother, and far more capable than anyone suspected, was more than ready for what came next. What Robert hadn't realized when he dropped those property transfer papers on my kitchen table was that he had just declared war on someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for this very battle. And in wars of patience and strategy, age and experience almost always triumph over youthful arrogance. I closed my eyes, a plan already forming in my mind, and slept more soundly than I had in years. The morning sunlight streamed through my kitchen window as I prepared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and fresh berries. My hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the arthritis, a lifetime of early rising ingrained in my body's rhythm. I had always found clarity in these quiet morning hours, and today I needed that clarity more than ever. My phone screen lit up with a text from Marcus, my attorney. "Documents ready as requested. Can meet at 10 a.m. I smiled, impressed by his promptness. I had called him last night after Robert's visit, explaining what I needed. Marcus had been handling my legal affairs for over 15 years, ever since I'd helped his mother, my dear friend Eleanor, navigate her own estate planning. Unlike most of the people in my life, Marcus knew exactly how substantial my assets were. "Perfect," I replied. "I'll see you then." As I rinsed my breakfast bowl, I mentally reviewed my plan. The pieces had been in place for years, scattered like chess pieces across various financial institutions, real estate holdings, and legal arrangements. Now it was time to bring them together in a coordinated strategy. Robert believed he was dealing with a financially struggling widow. By the time I was finished, he would understand just how profoundly he had misjudged me. At precisely 9:30 a.m., I locked my front door and walked down the curved garden path to my garage. Inside waited my 10-year-old Toyota, reliable, economical, and completely at odds with the luxury vehicle my son drove. That had been intentional. Every modest choice I'd made over the decades had contributed to the facade Robert now believed was reality. Downtown was busier than usual for a Tuesday morning. I found parking 2 blocks from Marcus's office, the walk giving me time to organize my thoughts. His office occupied the 4th floor of the Wellington building, a handsome brick structure that had housed attorneys and accountants since the 1930s. The elevator creaked familiarly as it carried me upward. "Margaret!" Marcus rose from behind his desk as I entered, coming around to greet me with genuine warmth. Unlike his colleagues with their power suits and aggressive demeanors, Marcus favored tweed jackets and bow ties, his manner more professorial than predatory. At 45, he was younger than me by a significant margin, but we had always related as equals. Right on time as always. "Punctuality is the courtesy of kings," I replied with a smile, settling into the comfortable leather chair across from his desk. "And we have much to accomplish today." Marcus nodded, his expression growing serious as he returned to his seat. "I prepared everything as we discussed last night." He slid a folder across the desk. "The revocation of power of attorney, the updated will, and the property trust documents are all here, requiring only your signature. But I must ask again, Margaret. Are you certain about this? Legally restructuring your assets this way will significantly impact Robert's inheritance expectations." I met his gaze steadily. "That's precisely the point, Marcus. My son's expectations have transformed into entitlement and manipulation. Yesterday, he presented me with property transfer papers, expecting me to sign over my home without question." Marcus's eyebrows rose. "Already? That's remarkably bold." "Bold or desperate," I replied, thinking of the luxury car payments and designer clothes that had likely stretched Robert's finances thin. In either case, it confirmed what I've suspected for years. He sees me as an obstacle to his inheritance, rather than as his mother. I opened the folder and began reviewing the documents, Marcus guiding me through the changes we'd discussed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. My home would be placed in an irrevocable trust with specific conditions for its use and eventual disposition. My financial assets would be similarly protected, with new estate planning structures that would make it virtually impossible for Robert to seize control, regardless of future circumstances. "What about Rebecca?" Marcus asked as I signed the trust documents. "You mentioned increasing her role?" "Yes," I confirmed. "She's always been responsible, thoughtful. Everything Robert is not. I'd like to grant her medical power of attorney, with you retaining financial power if I become incapacitated." Marcus made a note. "And you're prepared for Robert's reaction when he learns of these changes?" I paused, pen hovering over the final document. Was I prepared? The question carried more weight than Marcus likely intended. This wasn't just about legal structures and financial planning. It was about formally acknowledging a painful truth. My son, the little boy who had once rushed to greet me after school with drawings clutched in his small hands, had become a man who viewed my existence primarily in terms of what I could provide him. "I've had years to prepare," I said finally, signing my name with a firm hand. "But yes, I expect fireworks once he realizes he won't be getting what he anticipated." After finalizing the paperwork, Marcus walked me to the elevator. "The trust. Documents will be filed today. Everything else will be in place by tomorrow afternoon." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, Margaret, I think you're doing the right thing. My mother faced similar difficulties with my brother before she passed. She always regretted not taking more definitive action." I squeezed his arm gratefully. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a great deal." My next stop was across town at Meridian Financial, where Patricia had been managing my investments for over 2 decades. Unlike the stuffy formality of Marcus's law offices, Patricia's workspace was modern and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. She greeted me with a quick hug before guiding me to a conference room where spreadsheets and documents already awaited our attention. "I pulled everything together after your call," she said, pushing a sleek tablet toward me with a summary displayed on its screen. "Your current net worth stands at $3.7 million, not including the house or personal property." The figure still surprised me sometimes, the accumulated result of countless small sacrifices, strategic investments, and the compound growth of decades. After Edward died, leaving me with a 12-year-old son and minimal savings, I had clawed my way from secretarial work to financial advising, simultaneously learning to manage my own modest investments with increasing sophistication. "Perfect," I said, studying the portfolio breakdown. "And the new accounts are ready?" Patricia nodded, her silver bob swinging with the movement. "All prepared as discussed. Once activated, these changes will effectively restructure your holdings into the 3 tiers we outlined last year." She glanced up, her shrewd eyes assessing me. "Margaret, may I speak frankly?" "Always." "You've spent decades building this nest egg. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this reorganization now? It will significantly impact your liquidity in the short term." I appreciated her caution. It was one of the reasons I'd chosen her as my advisor after observing how she'd handled my colleagues' portfolios during market downturns. "I'm certain, Patricia. The security measures we discussed last year were a contingency plan. Recent events have made them a necessity." She didn't press further, simply nodding and proceeding to guide me through the extensive paperwork required to implement our strategy. By the time we finished 2 hours later, my investment portfolio had been restructured into multiple trusts and corporate entities, each layer providing additional protection and control. Much of it would be invisible to casual observation, but to anyone attempting to access or control my assets, it would present a formidable barrier. "There's one more thing," I said as we concluded. "I'd like to see a complete statement of my accounts, everything consolidated into a single document." Patricia raised an eyebrow but complied, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Minutes later, a comprehensive financial statement emerged from the printer, displaying in stark black and white the full extent of my financial position. "Planning to frame it?" she asked with a small smile as I carefully folded the statement and placed it in my handbag. "Something like that," I replied. "Let's just say it may prove educational for someone who has severely underestimated my circumstances." Leaving Meridian's offices, I checked my watch, nearly 2 o'clock. I had one more essential stop to make, but first I needed lunch. The morning's activities had left me more drained than I'd anticipated, the emotional weight of formally implementing these protective measures taking its toll. I found a small cafe nearby and ordered a salad and iced tea, using the quiet moment to center myself again. As I ate, I scrolled through my phone, checking messages. There were 3 missed calls from Robert, each accompanied by increasingly terse voicemails. "Mom, it's me. Just checking in about those papers. Call me back." "Mom, I really need an answer on this. The timing is important for our planning." "Mom, why aren't you picking up? This is getting ridiculous. We need to move forward on this house situation." I deleted each message without response. Robert's urgency only confirmed my suspicions. He had likely made commitments or plans based on the assumption that my acquiescence was inevitable. That misguided confidence would soon collapse, but not quite yet. Everything needed to be fully in place first. My final stop was Westlake Credit Union, where I'd maintained accounts since my earliest working days. Unlike the sophisticated investment strategies Patricia managed, my credit union accounts represented the practical, everyday financial foundation I'd built. Savings, checking, retirement accounts, all modest by comparison but essential to my overall financial structure. Thomas, the branch manager who had known me for nearly 30 years, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Chen, always a pleasure. What brings you in today?" "I need to make some adjustments to my accounts," I explained, explaining the specific changes I required. removing Robert as a contingent beneficiary on certain accounts, updating access, permissions, and establishing new security protocols. Thomas's expression grew serious as he processed my requests. "These are significant changes, Mrs. Chen. Is everything all right?" "Just updating things to better reflect my current circumstances," I replied smoothly. "Nothing to worry about." He nodded, though his eyes held a hint of concern. "Of course, it's always wise to keep these matters current." He processed the paperwork efficiently, occasionally glancing up as if wanting to ask more questions but respecting my privacy. By the time I finished at the credit union, afternoon was fading into early evening. I drove home through golden sunlight, a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration coursing through me. In a single day, I had fundamentally altered the financial and legal landscape of my life. For decades, I had maintained the appearance of modest means while quietly building substantial wealth. Now, those resources were protected in ways Robert had never anticipated. When I pulled into my driveway, I immediately noticed Robert's silver BMW parked at the curb. So he had grown impatient, coming to press his advantage rather than waiting for my call. I took a moment to collect myself, touching the financial statement in my handbag for reassurance, then walked calmly to my front door. I found him pacing in my living room, Diane nowhere in sight this time. He spun toward me as I entered, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Where have you been? I've been calling all day." His voice was sharp, accusatory. "I've been waiting here for over an hour." "I wasn't aware we had an appointment," I replied calmly, setting my purse down on the side table. "I had errands to run." "Errands?" he scoffed. "Mom, we need to finalize this house situation. I've already spoken with a realtor who can list it by the end of the week." The audacity took my breath away. Without my agreement, without even waiting. For my decision, he had already begun the process of selling my home out from under me. In that moment, any lingering doubt about my course of action evaporated completely. "I see," I said, keeping my voice level with effort. "You've been busy. Someone has to be practical about this," he replied, missing the edge in my tone. "Look, I've brought the papers again. All you need to do is sign, and we'll handle everything else. The realtor thinks we can get well above asking price in this market. I studied him, my son, my only child. When had he become this stranger who could speak so casually about disposing of my home, my sanctuary? When had financial calculations replaced basic human consideration in his mind? "Before I sign anything," I said carefully, "there's something I think you should see." I reached into my handbag and withdrew the financial statement Patricia had prepared, unfolding it deliberately. "You seem quite concerned about my financial situation. Perhaps this will alleviate your worries." Robert took the paper with a dismissive glance that quickly transformed into stunned attention. His eyes widened as they moved down the page, taking in the figures, the accounts, the totals. The color drained from his face. This can't be right," he stammered, looking up at me with disbelief. "These numbers. This says you have almost $4 million in assets." $3.7 million, to be precise, I corrected, gently. "Not including this house or my personal property." "But how? You've always—" He gestured vaguely at our surroundings, the modest furniture, the dated kitchen visible through the archway, the simple decor I'd maintained for decades. "I've always lived within my means," I finished for him. "A concept you might consider exploring." His legs seemed to give way as he sank onto my sofa, still clutching the statement. "I don't understand." "You never said anything." I let you believe what you wanted to believe," I interrupted. "You never asked about my finances, Robert. You assumed I was struggling because it suited your narrative. You saw what you expected to see, a helpless old woman who could be easily manipulated for your benefit." "That's not fair," he protested weakly. "I was worried about you. This house is too big. You could fall. Please. I held up a hand, silencing him. Let's not pretend anymore. I overheard you and Diane at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, discussing which nursing home would be cheapest once you got your hands on this house. I know exactly what your concerns are, and they have nothing to do with my well-being. The stunned look on his face confirmed I'd hit the mark. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed to ask, "So all this time, you've been, what? Testing me?" "Not testing, observing," I clarified. "Watching as you grew increasingly transparent in your expectations that I would simply hand over everything I've built. But here's what you need to understand, Robert. This house is mine. My money is mine, and as of today, all of it is legally structured in ways that ensure it remains under my control." His face darkened. "What does that mean?" "It means I've spent the day with my attorney and financial advisors, updating my estate planning. This house now sits in an irrevocable trust with specific conditions for its use and disposition. My financial assets are similarly protected." He stood abruptly, anger replacing shock. "You can't do that. I'm your son, your heir." "You are my son," I agreed. "But being my son doesn't entitle you to take what's mine before I'm ready to give. It doesn't grant you the right to make decisions about my home, my care, or my future without my consent." "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "All that money, sitting there while you live like this." He gestured at my modest surroundings with something approaching disgust. "I live exactly as I choose to live," I replied, my voice hardening. "Every decision I've made, from this house to my 10-year-old car, has been deliberate. I don't measure my worth by possessions or appearances. That's a lesson I apparently failed to teach you." Robert stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as his mother, not as an obstacle to his inheritance, but as an individual with agency and resources he'd never suspected. The realization seemed to physically affect him. He swayed, slightly, reaching for the sofa arm to steady himself. "I think I need to sit down," he said faintly. "Perhaps that would be best," I agreed, a flicker of concern despite everything. "Would you like some water?" He nodded, slumping back onto the sofa, the financial statement still clutched in his hand. I went to the kitchen, filled a glass with cold water, and returned to find him staring blankly at the wall, his face ashen. "All these years," he said as I handed him the water, "you let me think you were barely getting by. Why would you do that?" The question held genuine bewilderment. As if the concept of not flaunting wealth was utterly foreign to him, I sat in the armchair across from him, considering how to explain values he should have absorbed growing up, but somehow had not. "After your father died," I began carefully, "I had to make difficult choices. I could have used what little we had to maintain appearances, moved us to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, bought newer cars, kept up with the Joneses. Or I could focus on building real security while giving you what truly mattered: education, opportunities, stability." "But you could have had both," he protested. "With this kind of money." "I didn't start with this kind of money," I reminded him. "I built it over decades through careful investment and modest living. The habits that created this wealth became a way of life I found deeply satisfying. I don't need status symbols to feel successful, Robert." He took a long drink of water, his hand trembling slightly. "So, what happens now, with all this legal restructuring you've done?" "Now," I said simply, "you understand the reality of our situation. This house remains my home for as long as I choose to live in it. My finances remain under my control, and any future inheritance will be distributed according to my wishes, not seized ahead of time." Robert's eyes narrowed. "You're punishing me." "No," I corrected gently. "I'm protecting myself. There's a significant difference. He set the water glass down with a sharp click against the coffee table. Does Diane know about this? About my actual financial situation? No. Like you, she saw what she expected to see. A bitter laugh escaped him. She's going to lose her mind. I said nothing, waiting. Robert stood again, pacing the small area between the sofa and my reading chair. I could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. How this new information changed his plans, his expectations, his immediate future. I need to think, he said finally. This is a lot to process. Take all the time you need, I replied, rising to see him out. My decisions are made. At the door, he paused, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite read. A mixture of resentment, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant respect. You know, all this time I thought I was the one who understood money, investments, strategy, the big picture. But you... I had different teachers than you did, I said simply, and a different set of values guiding my decisions. After he left, I watched through the window as he sat in his car for several long minutes, his head bowed over the steering wheel. Finally, he started the engine and drove away, leaving me alone with the evening shadows stretching across my garden. Returned to my favorite chair by the window, feeling the weight of the day in every joint and muscle. The confrontation with Robert had gone much as I'd expected. Initial shock, followed by disbelief, anger, and finally, a grudging reassessment. What I hadn't anticipated was the hollow feeling now settling in my chest. This victory, necessary as it was, brought no joy. My phone chimed with a text from Rebecca. Hey, Aunt Marge, checking in again. Everything okay? I hesitated, then replied, Progress made on that family business. Could use some company this weekend if you're free. Her response came instantly. I'll be there Saturday morning. Love you tons. I smiled, warmth returning to push. Back the hollow feeling. One relationship damaged, perhaps beyond repair, but another, built on genuine care rather than expectation, remained steadfast. As the last light faded from my garden, I realized that in protecting my assets, I had also clarified something far more valuable: the true nature of the connections in my life, and which ones were worth nurturing in the years I had left. 3. Days passed without a word from Robert. The silence wasn't surprising. He needed time to recalibrate his strategy now that his assumptions about my finances had been shattered. I spent those days in peaceful routine, tending my garden, meeting with my book club, and enjoying the quiet autonomy I'd worked so hard to preserve. Each morning, I woke with a strange sense of lightness, as if revealing the truth had lifted a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was there. On the fourth day, a delivery truck pulled into my driveway. The driver emerged carrying an elaborate arrangement of orchids, my favorite flower, though I couldn't recall ever mentioning this preference to Robert. As I signed for the delivery, I felt a flicker of suspicion. This sudden attention to my personal tastes seemed calculated, especially after years of generic Mother's Day bouquets and Christmas poinsettias. The card attached was handwritten, a rarity for Robert, who typically delegated such personal touches to assistants or, more recently, to Diane. Mom, I've been doing some serious thinking. You were right. I made assumptions without asking, and I apologize. Can we start over? Dinner at Giovanni's tomorrow night, 7 p.m. my treat. Please say yes. Love Robert Giovanni's was the upscale Italian restaurant downtown where Edward had proposed to me 45 years ago. Robert knew the sentimental significance of the place. I had mentioned it several times over the years, though he had never before suggested dining there. The calculated sentimentality of the gesture was transparent, yet I found myself curious about his next move. What approach would he take now that his initial strategy had failed? I sent a brief text accepting the invitation, then carried the orchids to my sunroom. The flowers were undeniably beautiful, exotic purple blooms cascading from elegant stems. I arranged them near the window where the morning light would showcase their delicate petals. Robert's attempt at reconciliation was heavy-handed, but not entirely unwelcome. If nothing else, it promised to be an interesting evening. The following day, I dressed with deliberate care for our dinner. A navy silk blouse, paired with tailored gray slacks, accessorized with the simple pearl earrings Edward had given me on our 10th anniversary. I avoided anything that might reinforce Robert's outdated image of me as a frail, elderly woman. No comfortable cardigans or practical shoes tonight. Instead, I chose a stylish jacket and low heels that spoke of confidence rather than concession. To age, Giovanni's remained largely unchanged since Edward's and my last visit there on our 20th anniversary. The same warm lighting illuminated the brick walls adorned with black and white photographs of the Italian countryside. The air still carried the rich aromas of garlic, fresh basil, and simmering tomato sauce. As the maitre d' led me to our table, I noticed Robert already seated, checking his watch with typical impatience. He rose when he saw me, his surprise at my appearance briefly visible before he masked it with a warm smile. "Mom, you look fantastic," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek, a gesture I couldn't remember him initiating in years. "I was starting to worry you might change your mind." "I'm exactly on time, Robert," I replied with a small smile, settling into the chair he pulled out for me. 7 o'clock, as agreed. He checked his watch again, nodding. "Of course, you're right. I got here early, wanted to make sure we had the best table." He gestured expansively, as if he'd personally designed the intimate corner booth overlooking the restaurant's small courtyard garden. "Do you remember this spot?" "Very well," I said, unfolding my napkin across my lap. "Your father proposed to me at this very table. You mentioned that when you made the reservation, I assume?" A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "Actually, yes. I thought you might appreciate the gesture." "It was thoughtful," I conceded, though we both knew it was more calculated than sentimental. Still, I decided to allow him this small victory. "The restaurant hasn't changed much. Some things are better left alone," he replied, reaching for the wine list. "Classic, timeless, like you." I suppressed a smile at the flattery. Robert had always turned on the charm when he wanted something, even as a teenager negotiating for a later curfew or extra allowance. "What shall we drink to this evening?" I asked, deciding to move the conversation forward. "To new beginnings," he suggested, signaling the sommelier. He ordered an expensive Barolo without consulting me, another small power play I chose to overlook. The sommelier poured our wine. I studied my son over the rim of my glass. He looked tired, the strain of the past few days evident in the tight lines around his mouth and the slight dishevelment of his usually impeccable appearance. His designer shirt had a barely perceptible wrinkle at the collar, and his normally perfect hair showed signs of distracted fingers running through it repeatedly. "How's Diane?" I asked once the sommelier departed. Robert took a generous sip of wine before answering. "She's fine, busy with her charity work." The tightness in his voice told me more than his words. Clearly, Diane had not taken the revelation of my true financial situation well. I wondered if her absence tonight was by choice or by Robert's design. "Send her my regards," I said mildly. Robert nodded, then leaned forward, his expression shifting to one of practiced sincerity. "Mom, I need to apologize. The way I approached the house situation, it was insensitive. I should have discussed it with you differently." I noted his careful phrasing. He was apologizing for his approach, not for the underlying intention to take my home. "Apology accepted," I said simply, curious to see where he would take the conversation next. "The thing is," he continued, emboldened by my easy acceptance, "I've been worried about you for a long time. Living alone in that big house, Managing everything yourself. It seemed like an unnecessary burden at your age. At my age, I repeated with gentle emphasis. And what age would that be, exactly? He shifted uncomfortably. You know what I mean. Mom, you're active and sharp, but you're still turning 70 next month. Statistics show. Robert, I interrupted, keeping my voice level. Let's be clear. Your concern about my living situation had nothing to do with statistics and everything to do with assumptions about my finances. Now that those assumptions have been corrected, perhaps we can have a more honest conversation. The waiter arrived to take our orders, providing Robert a moment to compose himself. I selected the grilled branzino while he opted for veal saltimbocca, his father's favorite dish, another small detail that didn't escape my notice. When the waiter departed, Robert reached across the table to take my hand. The gesture was so unexpected that I almost pulled away, but curiosity kept me still. You're right, he said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. I made assumptions, and they were wrong. But finding out about your financial situation doesn't change the fact that I care about your well-being. If anything, it's a relief to know you're so secure. Is it? I asked, meeting his gaze directly. A relief? A flicker of something? Guilt? Annoyance? Crossed his face before he smoothed it away. Of course. What kind of son would I be if I didn't want financial security for my mother? I withdrew my hand gently but firmly. The kind who was counting on that mother's house to solve his own financial problems, perhaps? The directness seemed to catch him off guard. He reached for his wine glass, taking a long sip before responding. That's not entirely fair, Mom. Yes, Diane and I have had some investment setbacks recently. And yes, I thought consolidating our living situation might benefit everyone. But that doesn't mean I don't care about what's best for you. What investment setbacks? I asked, genuinely curious now. Robert had always been vague about his financial matters, deflecting my occasional questions with assurances that everything was more than fine or better than ever. He hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, he sighed, the facade of confidence slipping. The tech startup I invested in last year, it didn't work out. We lost a significant amount, and the housing market turned just after we upgraded to the new place in Lakewood Hills. How significant? I pressed. 400,000, he admitted, his voice barely audible above the ambient restaurant noise. Plus the increased mortgage and property taxes on the new house. I absorbed this information without visible reaction, though inwardly I was stunned by the scale of his losses. $400,000 was a staggering sum to risk on a single investment, especially for someone with Robert's responsibilities and relatively modest income from his middle management position. I see, I said finally. And you thought my house would solve these problems? Not exactly, he replied, an edge of defensiveness creeping into his voice. But yes, I thought it could help stabilize our situation. Our first courses arrived. AI, Caesar salad for Robert and minestrone soup for me. The interruption gave me time to consider his partial confession. He was revealing enough to appear honest while still concealing the full extent of his financial desperation. If he had lost $400,000 in a failed startup, I suspected there were other, equally poor decisions he wasn't disclosing. Robert, I said after the waiter departed, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to be equally honest with you. I have no intention of selling my home or altering my living arrangements to address your financial difficulties. His spoon paused halfway to his mouth. I understand that now. That's not what tonight is about. What is tonight about, then? I asked. He set down his spoon, composing his features into an expression of earnest concern. It's about finding a way forward that works for both of us. Now that I understand your financial position, I see that you don't need my help in the way I thought. But that doesn't mean we can't still support each other. Support each other, I repeated, testing the phrase. What did you have in mind? Robert leaned forward, his voice taking on the enthusiastic tone he used when presenting business proposals. I've been giving it a lot of thought. With your financial acumen and my business connections, we could create something remarkable together. A family office, perhaps, to manage your assets more aggressively. Or strategic investments in some opportunities I've been researching. And there it was. The real purpose behind the orchids, the sentimental dinner location, the practiced apology. Robert wasn't seeking reconciliation. He was seeking access to my money. That's an interesting proposal, I said, keeping my tone neutral. You're suggesting I allow you to manage my investments? Not alone, he clarified quickly. We'd work with top advisors, of course, but yes, I think together we could grow your assets significantly, make them work harder for you, for us, for the family legacy. I took a spoonful of soup, using the moment to collect my thoughts. The irony wasn't lost on me. Robert, who had just lost nearly $500,000 through poor investment choices, now wanted control of my carefully built portfolio. You know, I said finally, I've been working with Patricia Hamilton at Meridian Financial for over 20 years. My portfolio has consistently outperformed market averages under her guidance. Robert waved a dismissive hand. Patricia is fine. For conservative management, Mom. But with the right strategy, we could double or triple your returns. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. I have a friend who's been generating consistent 40% returns with a proprietary trading algorithm. Completely legitimate, just not available to the general public. I raised an eyebrow. Consistent 40% returns? That's quite remarkable. Almost unbelievable, one might say. The hint of skepticism in my voice seemed lost on him. Exactly. It's an incredible opportunity, but there's a minimum buy-in of $2 million. Obviously, that was out of reach for me. But for you. He trailed off, his implication clear. Our main courses arrived, momentarily halting the conversation. I watched, as Robert cut into his veal with enthusiasm, already considering my money as good as his to invest. The calculated nature of this entire evening, the flowers, the sentimental location, the practiced apology, all leading to this moment where he would present himself as the solution to a problem I didn't have. Robert, I said carefully, I appreciate your concern for my financial future, but I'm quite satisfied with my current investment strategy. But Mom, he persisted, you could be doing so much better. With returns like these, you could afford to upgrade your lifestyle significantly. A better car, renovations to the house, luxury travel, all while still growing your principal. I set down my fork, my appetite diminishing. Is that what you think I want? Luxury cars and expensive vacations? He blinked, genuinely confused. Well, isn't it? Everyone wants to maximize their enjoyment of life. I do enjoy my life, I replied. Very much. But my enjoyment isn't tied to material upgrades or status symbols. That's admirable, he said, though his tone suggested he found it more puzzling than praiseworthy. But think about the future, about securing the family legacy for generations to come. Family legacy. As if his interest extended beyond his immediate access to my funds. I decided to test the sincerity of his concern. Actually, I have been thinking about the future quite a bit lately, about how to ensure my assets benefit the causes and people I care about most. Robert brightened. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. In fact, I continued, watching him carefully, I've been exploring the possibility of establishing a charitable foundation. Something focused on educational opportunities for women returning to the workforce after raising children. Like I did after your father died. His smile faltered slightly. A foundation? That's an option to consider, certainly. But you'd need to be careful about tying up too much capital in philanthropy. Family security should come first. Family security, I repeated thoughtfully. Yes, that's important. which is why I've been updating my estate planning documents recently. Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Oh? What sort of updates? Just ensuring everything is properly structured, I said vaguely, making sure my wishes are clear and legally binding. I see. He set down his fork, his appetite apparently affected as well. I hope those wishes include provisions for your only son. They include provisions for many things that matter to me, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, including family, but also extending beyond it. A flash of calculation crossed his face as he reassessed his approach. Of course, that's completely reasonable. I've always admired your generosity, Mom. It's one of the many things I love about you. The practiced compliment fell flat between us. For a moment, we ate in silence, the pretense of a warm reunion dinner growing thinner by the minute. You know, Robert said finally, forcing brightness into his tone. Diane and I were talking about your birthday next month. 70 is a milestone, worth celebrating properly. We were thinking of hosting a party at our place, something elegant, with all your friends. That's very thoughtful, I replied, knowing full well that Diane had never voluntarily hosted any gathering on my behalf. But I've already made plans. Rebecca and I are going to the botanical gardens that weekend. They're having a special exhibition of Asian orchids that I've been looking forward to for months. Rebecca? He frowned slightly. Your niece? Mom? This is a significant birthday. You should spend it with immediate family. Rebecca is family, I said firmly. She calls every week and visits whenever her nursing schedule allows. She remembers my preferences and interests without being reminded. The implied comparison hung in the air between us. Robert's jaw tightened, briefly before he forced his features into a conciliatory smile. Of course she's family. I just meant, well, Diane and I wanted to do something special for you. But if you've made other plans, we understand. Perhaps we could do dinner the following weekend, I suggested, offering a small olive branch. Of course, he agreed quickly, though with noticeably less enthusiasm than when he was proposing access to my investments. Whatever works for you. As we finished our meal, the conversation drifted to safer topics. The restaurant's excellent wine selection, an upcoming exhibit at the art museum, the unusually mild spring weather. On the surface, we were simply a mother and son enjoying a pleasant dinner together. But beneath that veneer, we were engaged in a complex negotiation, each testing the other's boundaries and intentions. When the check arrived, Robert insisted on paying despite my offer to split it. I invited you, he said firmly. It's my treat. He handed his credit card to the waiter without looking at the total, a small performance of financial ease that I found telling given what he had revealed about his situation. Outside the restaurant, the evening air was cool and fragrant with early spring blossoms. Robert insisted on hailing a cab for me despite my protest that I had driven myself and was perfectly capable of getting home. At least let me walk you to your car, he said, placing a hand on my elbow with an attentiveness that felt performative, rather than genuine. It's just in the public garage around the corner, I conceded, allowing him to escort me. The walk gave him one more opportunity to press his case. Think about what I said, he urged as we approached my Toyota. About combining our financial resources and expertise. We could create something truly significant together, a legacy that benefits not just us, but future generations of our family. I turned to face him, studying the son I had raised with such hope and love. Despite everything, I still glimpsed occasional flashes of the bright, eager boy he had been, now buried beneath layers of entitlement and material ambition. It saddened me to recognize how thoroughly we had grown apart, our fundamental values diverging until we were almost strangers. I'll give it consideration, I said. Not quite a promise, but enough to end the evening without outright conflict. Thank you for dinner. It was a lovely gesture. He beamed, interpreting my response as encouragement. That's all I ask, he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. We'll talk more soon. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I reflected on the evening's carefully choreographed performance. Robert had revealed just enough vulnerability to appear honest while continuing to pursue his ultimate goal: access to my money. The orchids, the sentimental location, the practiced apology, all components of a strategy to manipulate rather than genuinely reconnect. Yet beneath my disappointment lay a surprising sense of clarity. For years, I had maintained a complex fiction about my finances, partly from habit and partly from a lingering hope that Robert would eventually see me as more than a resource to be managed. Tonight had confirmed what I had long suspected, but resisted acknowledging. That hope was misplaced. Our relationship had evolved into a transaction, a negotiation of access and control rather than mutual care and respect. Arriving home, I unlocked my front door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary I had created for myself. The house welcomed me with familiar creaks and shadows, every corner filled with memories and meaning that Robert had never bothered to understand or appreciate. I moved through the darkened rooms, turning on lamps as I went, reclaiming my space from the specter of his plans for it. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to my favorite chair by the window. Outside, the moon cast silver light across my garden, illuminating the early spring bulbs pushing through the soil with determined optimism. Life continuing, renewing, finding its way forward despite obstacles. My phone chimed with a text message from Robert. Thanks again for a wonderful evening. Looking forward to our partnership on this investment opportunity. We'll send details tomorrow. I set the phone aside without replying. He had heard what he wanted to hear, interpreting my non-committal response as tentative agreement. Tomorrow would bring another round in our ongoing negotiation, another attempt to breach the defenses I had so carefully constructed. But tonight, sitting in the quiet of my own home, surrounded by the life I had built through decades of careful choices and deliberate independence, I felt strangely at peace. The false reconciliation dinner had clarified what needed to be done next. Robert would not stop his pursuit of my assets. He would simply change tactics, shifting from demands to persuasion, from pressure to partnership. And I would be ready. Not with anger or rejection, but with clear boundaries and careful strategy. The next move in our complicated dance would be mine, and I intended to make it decisive. As I sipped my tea, watching moonlight play across my garden, I thought of Rebecca's upcoming visit that weekend. Unlike the orchestrated performance of tonight's dinner, her presence would bring genuine warmth and connection, the real relationship that money could neither buy nor corrupt. In that contrast lay all the confirmation I needed that my instincts were correct and my resolve justified. The battle lines had been drawn long ago. Tonight's dinner had simply illuminated them more clearly, revealing the true nature of what I was fighting to protect. Not just my financial independence, but my dignity and agency in the final chapters of my life. And those were treasures. I had no intention of surrendering, no matter how elaborate the strategy or how persuasive the performance. The morning after our dinner at Giovanni's, Robert's investment proposal arrived in my email with a level of polish that suggested he'd prepared it long before our conversation. Glossy graphics illustrated projected returns that defied financial reality, while carefully worded assurances promised family oversight of my assets. Reading between the lines, it was clear this partnership would grant him significant control over my finances while minimizing my actual input. I forwarded the proposal to Patricia without comment. Her response came within the hour. A single line that read, "Would you like me to outline exactly how many red flags are in this, or should I just say, absolutely not, and leave it at that?" I smiled at her directness, typing back, "Let's discuss in person. Tomorrow at 10? While Robert waited for my response to his proposal, I focused my attention on an entirely different matter: His revelation about losing $400,000 in a failed investment had triggered a quiet alarm. If he was desperate enough to gamble such a sum on a questionable startup, what other financial missteps might he have taken? And more. Importantly, had any of those decisions crossed legal or ethical boundaries? I called Marcus that afternoon explaining my concerns. It's not that I want to investigate my own son, I clarified, uncomfortable even saying the words aloud. But I need to protect myself. If Robert is in deeper financial trouble than he's admitted, I need to ensure there's no way he can access my accounts or entangle my assets in his problems. Marcus's response was measured but firm. Given what you've shared, I think a thorough review would be prudent. I have colleagues who specialize in forensic financial analysis. They're discreet, thorough, and can operate without alerting the subject of their inquiry. That sounds rather invasive, I hesitated, maternal instinct warring with self-preservation. Margaret, Marcus said gently, I understand your reluctance, but consider this. If Robert has nothing to hide, the analysis will simply confirm what he's already told you. If he's hiding something significant, wouldn't you rather know before you make any decisions about financial entanglements? He was right, of course. I gave my authorization, trying to ignore the pang of guilt that accompanied it. 3 days later, I opened my front door to find Rebecca standing on my porch, overnight bag in hand and a wide smile on her face. At 32, she had her mother's. Warm eyes and practical nature, her nursing career reflecting the same care for others that had defined my sister's life. Aunt Marge, she exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug that smelled of hospital antiseptic partially masked by floral perfume. I managed to swap shifts so I could stay until Sunday evening. Is that okay? More than okay, I assured her, taking her bag. I've missed you. Rebecca followed me inside, her trained eye sweeping the house for any changes or problems. Everything looks great, she observed, relaxing slightly. How have you been? Really? The simple question, asked with genuine concern rather than as a prelude to an agenda, nearly undid me. I busied myself with preparing tea to hide the sudden moisture in my eyes. I've been navigating some complicated family matters, I admitted, setting the kettle on the stove. Robert has been persistent about wanting me to sell the house. Rebecca's expression darkened. He's still pushing that? After you've made it clear you want to stay? It's more complicated now, I explained, briefly outlining the revelations of the past week, showing Robert my financial statements, his subsequent dinner invitation, and the investment proposal that had followed. Rebecca listened with growing indignation. So first he wanted your house and now he wants control of your money. That's... She bit off whatever she had been about to say, visibly restraining herself. I'm sorry. I shouldn't interfere in your relationship with your son. You're not interfering, I assured her, pouring the tea. You're caring, which is precisely what I need right now. Robert cares too, in his way, but his concern is filtered through his own interests. Rebecca accepted the teacup with a skeptical expression. That's a very generous interpretation. We moved to the sunroom, where afternoon light streamed through, the windows illuminating the orchids Robert had sent. Rebecca noticed them immediately. These are beautiful, she commented. A gift? From Robert, I confirmed. A prelude to his dinner invitation and investment proposal. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her silence more eloquent than words. I know, I acknowledged with a small smile. But regardless of his motives, they are lovely. We spent the afternoon catching up on Rebecca's work, her recent dating, misadventures, and her plans to eventually pursue a nurse practitioner degree. Her presence filled the house with a warmth and ease that had been missing during Robert's tense visits. When my phone chimed with yet another message from him, the third that day, asking if I'd reviewed his proposal, I silenced it without responding. You don't have to ignore him on my account, Rebecca said, noticing the gesture. "I'm not," I assured her. "I'm simply establishing boundaries. Robert needs to understand that I won't be rushed into financial decisions, nor will I. Prioritize his timeline over my own careful consideration?" Rebecca nodded, looking thoughtful. "It's strange. When we were growing up, I always envied Robert. He had this perfect mother who was so capable and strong. This beautiful house, all these opportunities. I never understood why he seemed so resentful." "Resentful?" I echoed, surprised by her perception. "Maybe that's the wrong word," she backtracked. "Just always looking elsewhere, wanting more. Even when we were teenagers, he talked about the things he'd do once he got out, like living here was some kind of prison sentence." The observation stung, though I couldn't deny its accuracy. Even as a child, Robert had always focused on what he didn't have rather than what he did: the larger houses of his friends, the newer cars, the exotic vacations. No matter how hard I worked to provide stability and opportunity, it never seemed quite enough to satisfy him. "I think," I said slowly, "that Robert and I simply value different things. I've always found security and stability in building something lasting. Robert seeks that same sense of security in acquisition, in visible signs of success." "Seems exhausting," Rebecca commented, reaching for a cookie from the plate between us. "Always wanting more, never appreciating what you have." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Not another text from Robert, but a call from Marcus. I excused myself to take it in the kitchen. "Margaret," he began without preamble, "we need to meet. The preliminary findings from the financial analysis are concerning. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning?" A chill ran through me. "How concerning?" "Not something I want to discuss over the phone," he replied, his tone grave. "But you should prepare yourself for some difficult information." After confirming the appointment, I returned to the sunroom, trying to maintain a calm exterior despite the knot of dread forming in my stomach. Rebecca, perceptive as always, immediately sensed the shift in my mood. "Bad news?" she inquired gently. "I'm not sure yet," I replied, making a quick decision about how much to share. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something important. Would you be willing to accompany me to a meeting with my attorney tomorrow morning? It's related to the situation. With Robert, and I could use your support." She didn't hesitate. "Of course, whatever you need." The following morning brought heavy rain, fat droplets streaking the windows of Marcus's office as Rebecca and I settled into chairs across from his desk. The atmosphere was somber, matching the leaden sky outside. "Thank you for coming, Margaret," Marcus began, nodding respectfully to Rebecca, whom I had introduced as both my niece and my trusted confidant. "As I mentioned on the phone, the financial analysis has revealed some concerning information regarding Robert's activities." He slid a folder across the desk. "This is the preliminary report. The full analysis will take another week, but these findings were significant enough that I felt you should be informed immediately." With trepidation, I opened the folder. The document inside was filled with financial terminology and legal references, but certain highlighted sections stood out with alarming clarity. Evidence suggests unauthorized investment activity using shared family identity markers, patterns consistent with identity borrowing or theft, credit applications bearing your social security number but not your signature, property liens established against potential inheritance assets. My hands began to shake. Rebecca leaned closer, her expression darkening as she read over my shoulder. "Marcus," I managed, my voice barely steady, "are you telling me that Robert has been, what, stealing my identity? Taking out loans in my name?" He nodded grimly. "The evidence strongly suggests that Robert has been systematically establishing lines of credit using your personal information. Most of these accounts were opened in the past 18 months, coinciding with the period he claims to have experienced investment losses." But how? I asked, bewildered. I monitor my credit. I would have seen these accounts. Not necessarily, Marcus explained. The report indicates these accounts were established with alternate contact information. Different. Mailing addresses, email accounts in your name but controlled by him. The statements and notifications would never have reached you. Rebecca's hand found mine, squeezing gently. Aunt Marge, this is serious. This is fraud. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Fraud. My son, committing crimes in my name, risking not just his financial future but mine as well. How much? I asked, the question barely audible. Marcus turned to a tabulated page near the back of the report. The total known liability currently stands at approximately $875,000. Spread across multiple accounts. There may be additional obligations not yet identified. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Nearly $1 million of fraudulent debt, all in my name, all created by my own son. What are my options? I asked when I could trust my voice. Again. Marcus's expression was carefully neutral. Legally, you have several paths. You could report the identity theft to the authorities, which would likely result in criminal charges against Robert. Alternatively, you could attempt to resolve the situation privately, though that would potentially leave you liable for the debts he's incurred. Criminal charges. My son, facing arrest, possibly prison. The thought was almost unbearable. Is there a middle ground? I asked, desperately seeking some option that wouldn't destroy what remained of our family. Possibly, Marcus allowed. We could confront Robert with the evidence, offer him an opportunity to address the situation through legal channels that might avoid criminal prosecution. A structured repayment plan, formal admission of liability, surrender of assets to cover the debts. Would that protect Aunt Marge? Rebecca asked, her nurse's practicality cutting through the emotional haze. To some extent, Marcus confirmed. We would need to formally separate her finances from these fraudulent accounts, file identity theft reports with the credit bureaus, and implement enhanced security measures. But yes, with proper documentation, we could likely shield Margaret from direct liability for these debts. I sat in silence, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. All those years of providing for Robert, of sacrificing to give him opportunities, of believing in his potential despite evidence to the contrary. And this was how he repaid that faith. Not just with ingratitude or emotional distance, but with criminal exploitation of my very identity. I need time to think, I said finally. This is overwhelming. Marcus nodded sympathetically. Of course, but I would advise against waiting. Too long. The longer these fraudulent accounts remain active, the more complex the resolution becomes. Rebecca drove me home through the rain, neither of us speaking until we were back in my kitchen. She put the kettle on while I sat at the table, still clutching the folder of evidence, still struggling to reconcile the son I loved with the person capable of such calculated betrayal. What are you thinking? Rebecca asked gently, setting a steaming mug before me. I'm thinking about consequences, I replied, wrapping my cold fingers around the warm ceramic, about actions and their ripple effects through time. She sat across from me, waiting patiently as I gathered my thoughts. When Robert was 16, I continued, he took money from my wallet without asking. $300 I'd withdrawn to pay the plumber. When I confronted him, he denied it, despite the evidence. I found the empty envelope in his trash with his fingerprints clearly visible on the adhesive flap. Rebecca listened, understanding this wasn't just a random memory, but a significant piece of the puzzle I was assembling. I could have called the police, I said. Could have reported him for theft, but he was my son, barely more than a child. So instead, I made him work off the debt, painting the garage, mowing lawns in the neighborhood, doing all the chores he normally avoided. I thought I was teaching him accountability while giving him a second chance. That sounds reasonable, Rebecca offered. But what if it wasn't? I countered, What if, by protecting him from the natural consequences of his actions, I taught him something else entirely? That there would always be a safety net, always someone to clean up his messes, always a way to avoid the full impact of his choices. Chaturi. Realization settled heavily in my chest. In trying to be a good mother, had I failed to prepare my son for the realities of adulthood? Had my protection become a form of destruction, enabling patterns that had culminated in this moment of crisis? "You couldn't have known," Rebecca said, reaching for my hand. "You made the best decisions you could with the information you had at the time." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but now I have new information, and I need to make a different kind of decision. One that considers not just Robert's immediate welfare, but the trajectory of his life. And mine." As the day progressed, I found clarity emerging from the chaos of emotion. By evening, I had formulated a plan, not just a reaction to Robert's betrayal, but a comprehensive strategy that might salvage something meaningful from the wreckage of trust. "I'd like you to be present when I confront him," I told Rebecca as we prepared dinner together. "Not to intervene, but to witness, to ensure there's another perspective beyond the tangle of our history." She looked concerned. "Are you sure that's wise? Robert might feel ambushed or embarrassed by having me there." "Possibly," I conceded. "But this conversation needs to happen on my terms, in my space, with my support system present. Robert sacrificed the privilege of privacy when he stole my identity." The next morning, I called Robert, my voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing of what I now knew. "I've reviewed your investment proposal," I told him. "I'd like to discuss it in person. Can you come by the house this afternoon around 2? "Absolutely." His enthusiasm was palpable. "I knew you'd see the potential once you looked at the numbers." "This is going to be great for both of us, Mom." "We'll discuss all the details when you arrive," I replied, leaving him with his misplaced optimism. After hanging up, I called Marcus, confirming he would be available by phone if needed during the confrontation. Then I gathered the documents I would need: the fraud report, financial statements from my legitimate accounts, and the new estate planning paperwork that had been finalized the previous week. At precisely 2:00, Robert's BMW pulled into my driveway. Through the front window, I watched him check his appearance in the rearview mirror, adjusting his tie and smoothing his hair with the practiced vanity that had always characterized him. Rebecca stood beside me, her presence a quiet source of strength. "Ready?" she asked softly. "Yes," I replied, more certain than I had felt in days. "It's time for truth." Robert entered with the confident stride of a man who believed he was about to achieve a significant victory. His smile faltered slightly when he saw Rebecca, confusion flickering across his features before he recovered. "Rebecca, nice surprise," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "I didn't realize you were visiting." "Robert," she acknowledged with a nod, neither warm nor overtly hostile. "I hope you don't mind," I said, gesturing toward the living room where I had arranged 3 chairs around the coffee table. "Rebecca is here at my request." His eyes narrowed slightly. "I thought we were discussing the investment proposal. Family business." "Rebecca is family," I replied simply. "And yes, we are indeed going to discuss business matters that affect this family. Please sit down." He complied, though tension had replaced his earlier confidence. I took the chair opposite him, with Rebecca, positioned slightly to the side, a silent witness to what would unfold. "I've reviewed your proposal," I began, watching him carefully. "And I've also reviewed some other financial documents that have recently come to my attention." I reached for the folder on the coffee table, opening it to reveal the fraud report with its highlighted sections clearly visible. Robert's eyes widened as he registered what he was seeing, a flush spreading up his neck to his face. "What is this?" he demanded, though the flash of panic in his eyes told me he knew exactly what it was. "This," I said evenly, "is a forensic financial analysis that details approximately $875,000 in fraudulent debt you've accumulated using my identity over the past 18 months. Credit cards, personal loans, equity lines, all established in my name but controlled by you." The color drained from his face as quickly as it had appeared. That's ridiculous," he stammered. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Robert. The evidence is quite clear. Account applications with my social security number but not my signature. Alternate contact information directing all communications to addresses and email accounts you control. Strategic timing of applications to avoid triggering fraud alerts." "Mom, I would never—" "Please," I interrupted, raising a hand. "Let's not compound the betrayal with lies. I have all the documentation here. The only question now is how we proceed." He stared at me, the facade of innocence crumbling as he realized the extent of what I knew. Then, in a shift that was both fascinating and disturbing to witness, his expression transformed from panic to calculation. "Okay," he said, leaning forward. "I admit I took some liberties with financial arrangements. But you have to understand, I was in a desperate situation. Those investment losses I told you about, they were just the beginning. There were other debts, other obligations I couldn't meet. I was trying to protect you from worry." "By committing fraud in my name?" I asked, my tone disbelieving. "I was going to pay it all back," he insisted. "That's what the investment proposal was about. With the returns we'd generate, I could clear all those debts and still create significant growth for both of us. I was trying to fix things." The audacity of his rationale was breathtaking. He had committed crimes, serious, destructive crimes, and was now presenting his latest scheme to access my legitimate assets as some sort of noble solution. "Robert," I said carefully, "you've committed identity theft and fraud. These are felonies. You could face significant prison time. For the first time," genuine fear flickered across his face, "you wouldn't press charges. I'm your son." "Yes, you are my son, which is why I'm giving you an opportunity to address this situation before it escalates to criminal proceedings." I slid another document across the table. "This is a structured resolution plan developed by my attorney. It outlines a path forward that might allow you to avoid prosecution." He scanned the document, his expression darkening as he grasped the terms. "This would bankrupt me," he protested. "Liquidating my assets, structured repayments for 15 years, financial monitoring, surrender of property. This is extreme." "What's extreme?" Rebecca interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. "Is stealing nearly $1 million from your own mother and then having the nerve to complain about the consequences." Robert shot her a venomous look before turning back to me, his voice softening, becoming cajoling. "Mom, be reasonable. This plan would destroy everything I've built. There has to be another way. What if you just covered the debts? You have the resources. We could restructure the loans legitimately, set up a more manageable repayment plan between us." "No," I said firmly. "I will not cover your fraud. Robert, not this time. The pattern stops here." He stared at me, disbelief giving way to anger. "So that's it? After everything, you're just going to throw me to the wolves? What happened to maternal love, to family loyalty?" "Love isn't enabling destructive behavior," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the ache in my heart. "Love is holding you accountable so you have a chance to become the person you're capable of being. Real loyalty isn't blind protection. It's commitment to truth, even when that truth is painful." "Spare me the fortune cookie wisdom," he snapped, his mask of contrition falling away completely. "If you really loved me, you'd help me out of this mess, not threaten me with prison." "I am helping you," I insisted. "I'm offering you a path that includes restitution rather than incarceration." That's more consideration than most identity theft victims would show their perpetrators. He stood abruptly, pacing across the living room like a caged animal. You always do this. Act like you're being so reasonable while backing me into a corner. You think because you lived some frugal, boring life and squirreled away a few million, you have the right to judge me? At least I tried to live fully, to seize opportunities, to build something exciting. And look where that's gotten you, I observed quietly. Debt. Fraud. Desperation. He spun toward me, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. You sanctimonious... He caught himself, visibly restraining whatever he had been about to say. Instead, he took a deep breath, his businessman's mask sliding back into place. Fine, he said with forced calm. I'll review the agreement with my attorney, but don't expect me to just roll over and accept these terms. You might find your precious reputation isn't something you want dragged through public fraud proceedings, either. The threat was unmistakable. If I pursued this, he would make it as messy and public as possible. I didn't flinch. Review it with your attorney, I agreed. But understand that the alternative is formal identity theft charges filed with the police and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The documentation has already been prepared. The choice is yours. Robert snatched the agreement from the coffee table, folding it roughly and shoving it into his jacket pocket. I'll be in touch, he said coldly, moving toward the door. As he reached for the handle, I spoke one last time. Robert. He paused without turning. I still love you. That hasn't changed, but I will not be your victim anymore. He said nothing, simply yanking the door open and striding out. We heard the BMW's engine rev aggressively, tires squealing as he accelerated down the driveway. In the silence that followed, Rebecca moved to sit beside me, her arm wrapping around my shoulders. You did the right thing, she said softly. That took incredible courage. Did I? I wondered aloud, the adrenaline of confrontation fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Sometimes the right thing feels remarkably like failure. It's not failure to hold someone accountable, she insisted. It's not failure to refuse to be exploited, even by someone you love. I leaned into her support, grateful for her presence, for her uncomplicated affection. The strange thing is, I reflected, despite everything, I still have hope for him. Not that he'll suddenly transform into the son I always wanted, but that perhaps, with proper boundaries and consequences, he might eventually find a better path. Rebecca nodded, understanding. The most loving thing isn't always the easiest thing. As afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in golden beams, I felt the first stirrings of peace amidst the wreckage of expectations. The confrontation had gone much as I'd anticipated. Robert's initial denial, followed by rationalization, manipulation, anger, and finally threats. Yet through it all, I had maintained my resolve, had refused to abandon my boundaries even in the face of his emotional leverage. For the first time in decades, I had responded to Robert not as the idealized son of my hopes and dreams, but as the flawed, complicated man he actually was. And in doing so, I had finally honored both of us with truth. Whether he would accept that truth, whether he would choose the path of restitution or force matters into the criminal justice system, remained to be seen. But I had done what was necessary, not just to protect myself, but to offer him the one thing I had withheld for too long, the dignity of consequences. 6 months passed like the slow turning of seasons. Autumn painted my maple trees in fiery hues before surrendering to winter's quiet dormancy. Through it all, my house remained my sanctuary, unchanged except for the photographs I'd added to the mantel, new ones of Rebecca at her graduation ceremony, receiving her nurse practitioner certification. Robert's absence created a strange peace. Following our confrontation, he had grudgingly signed the restitution agreement rather than face criminal charges. The terms were harsh but necessary: liquidation of his luxury assets, downsizing to a modest apartment, structured repayments, and mandatory financial counseling. Most painfully for him, the agreement required full disclosure to Diane, who had promptly filed for divorce upon learning the extent of his deception. On a crisp February morning, as snowflakes dusted my garden, in delicate white, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened it to find Robert standing on my porch, nearly unrecognizable. Gone were the designer clothes and carefully styled hair. Instead, he wore a simple wool coat over a sweater, jeans, and practical boots. His face looked leaner, the entitled smugness replaced by something more humble, more authentic. "Mom," he said simply. "May I come in?" I stepped aside silently, studying him as he entered. He moved differently. Less swagger, more care. His eyes, when they met mine, held a clarity I hadn't seen in years. "Coffee?" I offered, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar terrain. "Please," he nodded, following me to the kitchen where he sat at the same table where, months earlier, he had demanded I sign over my home. I busied myself with the coffee maker, giving us both time to adjust to this unexpected reunion. When I finally placed a steaming mug before him and took the seat opposite, the silence between us felt less hostile, more contemplative. "I've been in therapy," he said without preamble. "Twice weekly since everything happened." "That's good," I replied cautiously. "It's been eye-opening," he continued, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Painful, but necessary. I've had to confront some ugly truths about myself, about the patterns I've been repeating my entire adult life." I remained silent, allowing him this moment of reflection without interruption. I kept thinking success meant accumulating more money, more status, more possessions. He said, his voice thoughtful. I was so fixated on projecting success that I didn't notice I was destroying everything that actually mattered. Outside, the snowfall intensified, creating a hushed, private world where only this conversation existed. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Robert continued. "What I did was unforgivable. I betrayed your trust in the most fundamental way. But I wanted you to know I'm committed to making amends, not just through the financial restitution, but by becoming someone worthy of being your son." The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep within me. Not enough to erase the past, but perhaps enough to consider a different future. "Are you working?" I asked, genuinely curious about his new life. He nodded. "2 jobs, actually. Accounting at a small nonprofit during the day and bartending 3 nights a week. It's barely enough to cover the repayments and my living expenses, but—" He paused, a small, genuine smile appearing. "There's a dignity in it I never expected to find." "And Diane?" His expression sobered. "The divorce was finalized last month. She's already dating a surgeon." He shrugged, surprisingly without bitterness. "I can't blame her. She married the man she thought I was, not the man I actually am." We talked for nearly an hour, not about reconciliation or the past, but about his daily life now, the small apartment he'd found, his co-workers at the nonprofit who were becoming friends, the community service he'd begun as part of making amends. When he finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I brought you something," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He handed me a small folded paper, a check for $3,500. "It's not much compared to what I owe, but it's the first payment I've been able to make beyond the structured minimum. I wanted to give it to you in person." I looked at the check, noting the neat handwriting so different from his previously hasty scrawl. "Thank you," I said simply. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "I don't know if we can ever rebuild what was broken. But I'd like to try, on whatever terms you're comfortable with." Looking at him, this changed man wearing humility like a new but increasingly natural garment, I felt something shift within me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps its earliest precursor. Possibility. Perhaps, I suggested carefully, we could start with coffee. Once a month. Hope flickered in his eyes. I'd like that. After he left, I stood at my window watching his modest used sedan navigate the snowy street. The future remained uncertain, our relationship forever altered by the truths we had finally confronted. Yet in that uncertainty lay a strange kind of freedom. The liberation that comes from abandoning illusions and accepting reality, however painful. My house still stood, solid and unchanged around me. But within its familiar walls, something new had taken root. Not the blind optimism of maternal love, but the cautious, clear-eyed hope that sometimes, when we least expect it, people can actually change. Not overnight, not completely, but enough to glimpse the possibility of redemption, one humble step at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.